Good morning. Now I've heard a few of the speakers who've gotten up here who've said that they were intimidated. Now I see why. This reminds me of when I was teaching at Arizona State in an African American history class. I had a student who came up to me, who was the president of something called the Black Women's Task Force, and I thought it was some little tiny little group who, a bunch of black women who kind of got together, and they were like my club women that I studied. And she asked me to introduce their speaker who was coming to town. It was going to be Angela Davis. Well, I got all excited. And she told me, she said, well, you can think about it. Well, I didn't have to think about it. I was going to get to introduce Angela Davis. But she said, well, you might really want to think about it. Why don't I ask you again next week? And I said, okay. I did think about it. Came back, of course, and told her yes. Because I'd never met Angela Davis before. And she waited a couple of days to finally tell me that I was then invited to some sort of reception that they have before this big to-do. And it was at the reception that they then told me that 2,000 people show up at this thing. Well, I'm thinking it's going to be like, 20 women, and I get to introduce Angela Davis. So that's much of what this feels like. I was quite intimidated. After she told me, I ran home. I called my friends in Charlotte and said, I can't do this. I'm going to have to tell her I can't do it. Ultimately, I did. And actually, it was very welcoming because any of you who've been in Arizona, as Darlene just left, you have to know how isolating it can be for an African-American woman. And so it's really nice to be here. It was nice to be in front of the Black Women's Task Force and all the people who were there. And in many ways, this is similar because I belong. And it's really nice to see so many African-American women's faces. And so I have to thank Deborah Gray White for inviting me and also making me talk about Fannie Berry Williams, because I was going to talk about my essay in the book, and she kept telling me that I need to talk about Fannie so that people would know that I actually was doing Fannie. And I kept sort of emailing her back. And if you know Deborah, she gets very impatient. And she finally told me to give her a title, so I did. And she said, well, there you go. So anyway, I've saved this email. I do want to talk about Fannie Berry Williams, but I will talk about her in the context of Black Women in the Academy, and specifically about her and, in many ways, our parallel lives and the continuity, the elements of continuity in our lives. We are very, very different people, but hopefully from this piece you'll begin to see some parallels not only in her life, but in my life, but also in yours as well. The January 31st, 1895 issue of Unity, a Unitarian magazine, noted that 3 significant events had occurred in Chicago that, quote, has promoted right thinking about issues regarding the color line, end quote. One dealt with the annual meeting of the Anti-Lynching League, where Ida B. Wells was present, and another with the visit of Booker T. Washington. But the first one mentioned was perhaps evident of the most significant change. It noted, quote, the Women's Club, and they were referring to the Chicago Women's Club, after much parliamentary sparring, social agitation, and private heartburning, has found the American consolation to an abused conscience. For it has passed a resolution saying, in effect, that merit and not color is the condition of membership in the club, end quote. But passing a resolution in the Chicago Women's Club was one of the most powerful elite white women's organizations in the country. Actually, putting it into practice was quite another. Even the editor of Unity understood the intractability and thorny nature of racial segregation and social equality in the last decade of the 19th century. It now remains to be seen, the editorial concluded, whether the Women's Club will do what they have so laboriously declared their willingness to do and put a colored woman's name on their list, end quote. Though not mentioned by name, the origins of the resolution and the editorial stemmed from the membership nomination of African-American social welfare reformer, clubwoman, and intellectual Fannie Berry Williams. First introduced to the membership committee in 1894, Williams was quickly dismissed as a viable candidate. The rejection, however, failed to silence the supporters, who happened to be all white women, who were determined to force a constitutional change, so they had a hidden agenda, address the question of race, and reinvigorate the debate about membership qualifications. A group of Williams supporters insisted that Williams be admitted because she reflected the impeccable character and intelligence demanded of the membership. To the chagrin of the committee, the supporters reintroduced Williams' name shortly after the resolution passed, forcing the CWC into the unenviable position of engaging in an internal membership struggle and a public battle with the religious organization, the media, and black women. The internal conflict was so acrimonious that several angry members vowed to resign from the organization if Williams was admitted. The Unitarians, one of the most liberal religious groups in the city, followed the story carefully. The minister of All Souls and his wife expressed outrage over the dismissal and commented about Williams' superb qualities and unquestionable character. Nationally, black club women, understanding the far-reaching race and gender implications, championed her efforts by chronicling their anger and frustration over her treatment in the women's era, reporting that, quote, the modicum of Negro blood in her veins outweighed her eminent fitness, end quote. The era labeled the situation as blatant racism. Less than a year after the Unity article appeared, and less than a year after the Women's Era essay appeared, readers of the Friday edition of the Chicago Tribune learned that after much dissension and friction on the membership committee, the CWC had finally been successful in, quote, breaking down the color line, end quote. So titillating a story it was, even Western newspapers reported on it. The San Francisco Chronicle boldly declared in this headline, quote, a colored woman wins. How many times do we see that? Followed by the subtitle, Mrs. Fannie B. Williams admitted to a Chicago club. Williams, of course, was elated with the outcome and even concluded that those who fought against her were, quote, prejudiced, mean, and hopeless, end quote. The story and the interest that it produced highlights the fortitude and the tenacity that it took for black women like Williams to break down the race and gender barriers and limits imposed on them. While the story ends triumphantly, it does not tell us what happened once she was admitted, much like the Academy. Unfortunately, the CWC was not transformed, for the resolution was not extended to other black women. Williams would remain the only black woman for decades. To suggest that Williams' fight was only about race, however, is to oversimplify her struggle. Race certainly played a prominent role in determining whether she was fit or not for a place among these elite white women. But as the black club women who read the Women's Era understood, another objection to her admission centered around the question of her suitability and whether a black woman could be recognized as a social and intellectual equal to white women. To do so directly challenged segregationist ideology about the inferiority of black people and the morality and ineptness of black women. In responding to the CWC's rejection of Williams, the Women's Era highlighted her intellect and executive experience by producing a resume that included several leadership roles in the interracial organization, the Illinois Women's Alliance, and her skills and as accomplished and much sought after lecturer to demonstrate the fundamental similarities she shared with white women. Notably, the San Francisco Chronicle clearly identified Williams as an, quote, intellectual colored lecturer, end quote, endowed with what the Unitarian, a magazine of liberal Christianity, called, quote, a rare ability, end quote. Williams's battle also raises questions, however, about her role, about the role of black men in the oppression and her oppression, as well as other African American women in the late 19th century. While most black men championed her success as a race woman, particularly as she fought against white women, many failed to acknowledge her as an intellectual peer. One prominent black Chicagoan reportedly became so incensed with the tone and content of some of her newspaper articles, he publicly denounced her and put forth a club meeting resolution to, quote, brand each and every statement of Mrs. Williams as being false, end quote. Moreover, he characterized her ideas as dangerous and tied her to the, quote, Negro-hating class of white people in the southern states and their sympathizers in the north, end quote. In turn, Williams bitterly criticized black men. She complained in one article, quote, "For the most part, the chivalry of colored men for colored women has in it but little heart and no strength of protection," end quote. So who was Fannie Berry Williams, and what can her struggle tell us about the race and gendered context of black women's lives in the academy? In many ways, her background fits neatly into the Ivory Tower faculty model. Had she lived in another time, and she might have been in the academy. She was born shortly before the Civil War began into a prominent black family in an overwhelmingly white village of Brockport, New York. Her mother, Harriet, was a homemaker. Her father, Anthony, was a successful barber. Both were well-read, and they had a library in their home. They owned their own home and over time purchased several other properties in the village. The family attended a predominantly white Baptist church where Anthony served in various elected roles as treasurer and deacon, and they actually entrusted him with the money. Her mother, Harriet, was also active in the church, becoming a Sunday school teacher. Williams developed strong and enduring friendships with white children. She attended a private church-affiliated collegiate institute that included white teachers, staff, administrators, and students. Like many of her generation, she graduated from a normal school that provided her with a teaching certificate. Though Williams and I were born 99 years apart, in two different regions of the country and under very different circumstances, there are several elements of continuity in both our struggles and our histories. First, we both came of age at a time of unprecedented opportunity for black women. She during Reconstruction, when normal schools educated the bulk of teachers who flooded Southern schools in a desperate attempt to educate black children. And I, in the post-Brown v. Board of Education decision and the waning years of the Civil Rights Movement that ultimately forced the extension of educational opportunities in predominantly white colleges and universities to black students. Second, the journey for Williams and me share similar circuitous characteristics. Neither was direct nor uncomplicated. She fulfilled a dream of teaching, fulfilled a dream of assisting the newly freed men and women by finding employment as a teacher in the segregated public school system in Washington, D.C. The work was difficult and exhausting. Long hours, overcrowded conditions, and inadequate facilities overwhelmed her. She sought solace in the arts by taking a leave of absence to attend the New England Conservatory of Music, where she studied painting, piano, and drawing. Criticized for seeking personal fulfillment over the grueling demands of public instruction, one editorial noted that, quote, "While a pleasant lady, she wasn't a very good teacher because her heart was not in her work," end quote. There may have been some truth to the observation, but because Williams faced the financial constraints that plagued and continues to plague most black women, she could ill afford to antagonize the press or the school administrators. So unable to completely abandon her teaching position, she returned to the classroom. She finally quit when she married Samuel Lane Williams, or many of you may know him as S. Lane Williams, in 1887 at the age of 32. And in Victorian America, that was old. I fulfilled my professional dream by being the first in my immediate family to graduate from a four-year institution and becoming a teacher in my hometown school system, the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Schools, in 1976. 7 years later, I too had burned out. Toward the end, I fought constantly with the principal about the role of academics, about student responsibility, and about parental interference. I sought comfort, and well, unlike many of you who may have taught in public schools, I was in a predominantly white institution in a very wealthy area. We had black students, but most of them were bused in, so the interference primarily came from the wealthy white kids' parents, because I was a black teacher. But anyway, I sought comfort and intellectual stimulation in the graduate evening classes at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. Unfulfilled and yearning for something that I couldn't quite articulate, I took a leave without pay after being accepted into the MA program at Wake Forest University in Winston-Salem. Financial restraints forced me to return to the school system the following year. But admission to the PhD program at Purdue University, where I met Darlene Clark Hine, the following year allowed me to finally quit a job that I had come to detest. I was 30 years old. Third, as women, Williams and I have been presented with special personal challenges that impact our professional lives. Family obligations have forced us to postpone and or sacrifice professional aspirations. Well, when Williams lost her father in the early 1890s, she and her sister Ella, rather than her married brother George, assumed primary roles as caretakers for their mother. She often visited Williams and her husband in Chicago, staying for months at a time. Also, Williams and her sister Ella traveled to Brockport most summers, seeing to their mother's needs. To compensate for those early years and for the limits to her professional life, Williams engaged primarily in local activities such as assisting with the creation of Providence Hospital or writing a monthly column that did not require travel. In my case, the loss of my father, Joshua, and my mother, Velma, who died less than 4 years apart, shattered my security and thrust me in an adult role long before I was ready at the age of 9 and 13. Like her, my sister Anita and I remain quite close. Yet our relationship has always been one touched by illness and dependence. She inherited my mother's kidney ailment and has lived with a chronic illness most of her life. And she'd be horrified that I'm talking about her. The burden, if she were here, the burden and joy of assisting and caring for her falls to me, the eldest daughter of 3 boys and 2 girls. Supporting her has been exhausting, but fortunately, when the tenure clock required that I produce a published manuscript, I found the personal reserves to meet the demand. It is unclear to me now whether or not the requirements for promotion will or can be met, since her medical needs recently have escalated, the hospitalizations have become more common, and travel for me much more frequent. Finally, the marginalization that shaped Williams's life more than a century ago profoundly impacts mine. While the Academy is open to me in ways that Williams could never have envisioned, it is oftentimes as inhospitable as the CWC was to Williams when she was finally admitted. Admission might offer tolerance, but does not guarantee acceptance, as Williams found out. Few students today use the N-word to describe African Americans in United States history, as they did when I taught my first U.S. History Survey class in my first faculty position. But many are still surprised to see me as the professor in the United States History Survey classes, a core part of the university curriculum. Collegial relationships remain a minefield, as gendered and racial cliques form and ideological divisions cater to certain segments of the faculty, often devaluing the work of others, particularly African American women. Service work imposed on black female faculty continues to detract from research, limiting the number of black female full professorships. But what I have learned in writing a biography of Fannie Berry Williams is that she was a pragmatist, using her energies, fighting only those battles that she thought she could win. While her tenure in the CWC did not transform the organization, she remained true to her central mission of engaging in philanthropic work efforts that assisted the black community, that assisted black girls, and that assisted black women in some tangible way. She also found opportunity in her controversial admission to the CWC. She combined it with combined the national publicity from it with a professional resume that included club work in black and white women's organizations, elected executive positions, and speaking engagements before black and white audiences to launch a career that spanned 3 decades. Apparently, people enjoyed seeing somebody, the first colored woman, to actually get in the CWC. She became such a popular lecturer that she hired a Lyceum Bureau to publicize, advertise, and book her engagements. In addition, she built a scholarly and literary cachet. Between 1894 and 1900, she wrote nearly a half a dozen essays and articles. Before World War I, she had added nearly 20 more. In many ways, Williams's life, like mine, and those of other black women in the Academy, indicates the extraordinary resilience of Black women who continue to live under such unyielding restraints. Thank you.